Topic note 6.3, coral reef dynamics. And there is a lot going on in the case of reefs. There's a lot of diversity and there's a lot of interaction. So let's get into it. So our main ideas here is that there is a balance between constructive and destructive forces on a reef. Changes to the biotic and abiotic factors in the ocean can lead to the erosion of coral reefs. And artificial structures can be provided as substrate on which reef communities can develop. Now, do notice in terms of the learning goals, there are a lot of green supportive learning goals in this one that help you kind of get a better grasp of what's going on a reef so that you can be more prepared to answer more complex questions in the ACE curriculum. Investigating reef zonation allows us to get a better idea of what's going on within a reef track. And it generally starts with what we call the reef front or slope. And this is where corals start to become abundant above 50 meters. And this is, of course, facing the wider open ocean. So this is where big waves and swells are coming in. And right above the reef front or slope, you have the forereef. And this is like the major part of the reef that most of us go snorkeling and diving on, things like that. It's very variable, but oftentimes we get what we call a spur and groove formation. On this aerial overlay, you can see sort of the spur and groove formations where you have the darker zones. That's where the rock is a bit higher and the corals are a little bit more shallow. And then you have the grooves, which are your sandy sort of channels. And with the waves coming in and out, that sand moves back and forth along the channels, kind of carving those channels out. Now at the very top, we have what we call the reef crest. And this is the part that really receives the full impact of large waves as they come in because it's the shallowest. It's essentially where the coral has grown as high as it can at the water level that is available to it. This is also where you will get some exposure to air, and that's usually what stops coral growth, of course, because coral can't grow that high into the air, and tides kind of can make a difference there as well. Now in the back of the reef crest, we have the reef flat or back reef. And this is that shallow area behind the algal ridge and the crest that has a variety of habitats, including patch reefs, seagrass beds, and even farther inland mangrove forests. If you have an environment that's known for its incredibly high biodiversity, you know that there's a decent amount of productivity involved here, of course, as well. And tropical marine waters are generally poor in nutrients and tend to have low productivity. So this kind of bodes the question, well, if that's the case, why are there so much diversity there at coral reefs? Well, coral reefs have very high productivity in a low nutrient environment. Now, this is not completely understood, but the reasoning we believe is that there is a very tight recycling of nutrients by coral and other living organisms. Now, what do we mean by that? Think about it. Coral has a symbiotic relationship, a mutualistic relationship with zooxanthellae, which go through photosynthesis. They're producers that live in their tissues. So that is a really tight relationship because your plants, your producers, are essentially living in the animal's tissue and providing it nutrients directly. And the animal is providing the plant, the dinoflagellates, the zooxanthellae, nutrients directly. So this is a very tight relationship. We also think that there are very high flow rates, bringing nutrients over time into the system. And upwelling and groundwater leaching can also be a part of this. We've been tracking this here in Palm Beach County as well, because we do see nutrients coming off of our land through aquifers and essentially seeping out of the seabed. Now, this can sometimes be a negative thing for us, of course, when we have too much nutrients going on due to wastewater and whatnot that happens on land with development. But from a natural perspective, there might be a little bit of that as well. Now, just to give you some perspective here, the gross primary productivity of estimates there on the bottom right, coral reefs are looking at somewhere between 1,500 to 5,000 grams of carbon per meter square per year. On the other hand, in open tropical oceans, there's between 18 and 50 grams of carbon per meter per square per year. Now that's a lot less than coral reefs by a big amount. So you know there's something going on in coral reefs. Competition for space is actually quite fierce on a coral reef. Light and space are limiting factors on a coral reef. Corals and other sessile organisms develop strategies to overgrow, sting, and even kill their competitors using various types of strategies, including chemicals and sting cells and all sorts of things. Now, algae can overgrow and smother a coral as well, but is generally kept under control by grazing animals such as fish and sea urchins. Atlantic and Indo-Pacific reefs are actually a bit different. Now, Pacific reefs are older than Atlantic reefs, and now this is a geologic issue. If you go back to our talk on geology and the theory of plate tectonics, think about how the Atlantic Ocean formed. It formed as the mid-ocean ridge spread, pushing North America, Europe, and Africa and South America apart, right? Now, by the time that started happening, the Pacific Ocean was already old. And so that's where that comes into play. The Atlantic Ocean has had less time to diversify. Now, there are higher diversity of corals and marine life essentially in the Pacific comparatively to the Atlantic. And there's a higher percentage of reef covered with what we call hard coral, up to almost 100%. And if you look at the left, picture on the left, that's what we're talking about. Now, the Atlantic reefs have up to about 60% stony coral coverage, and the rest of them are soft corals, gorgonians, sea fans, things like that. There are constructive and destructive forces that you need to know about on the reef. Now, we'll start with our constructive forces. Now, a healthy coral reef can gain 5 to 15 meters of calcium carbonate every 1,000 years. Now, this is accelerated by two kind of balances here. You've got the large, massive corals, which are about 5 to 25 millimeters per year of growth, and the faster branching corals, which are up to about 20 centimeters per year. Notice the difference between millimeters and centimeters there. The branching corals grow a lot faster. However, the massive corals are just that, more massive, right? So modern coral reef systems are between 5,000 and 10,000 years old. So these things can get rather old. And you also have to look at some other factors. For example, coral rubble and calcareous deposits from other organisms, such as calcareous algae, for example, we call coralline algae, actually do add to the calcium deposits on a reef. Now, any new surface that can provide a place for larvae to settle will begin a new coral colony. And we do some investigating on this type of thing and looking at calcification rates in general across reefs. You'll see on the bottom right there are a few pictures of these like plates, these metal plates. One is clean, you don't see anything growing on it, and the other one on the right, bottom right, is a little bit more encrusted with algae and stuff. That's all in calcium carbonate encrusted organisms. And we put these calcification monitoring plates out in the reefs to try and gauge about how much calcium is being deposited in an annual basis. Now let's look at the flip side, which would be erosion. Now, erosion is when a coral loses more of its calcium carbonate skeleton per year than it gains. And you can look at this also from an aspect of a larger reef system as well. And this occurs in a number of different ways we're going to get into. First up is good old bioerosion, and this is erosion caused by living organisms. And this can occur from quite a few different organisms. For example, butterfly fish specialize in consuming a few species of polyps specifically, and you see a butterfly fish on the bottom right over there. Parrotfish are grazers. They consume coral to get the zooxanthellae that are inside of them. So they use their beak-like mouths, their beak-like teeth structures, to bite off portions of rock. Now, this stuff is not really digested very well, and this organic material is actually pooped back out, as well as some calcium carbonate in the feces. And you can see a parrotfish pooping there in the middle picture. Crown of thorns sea stars are also an impact on corals. These are coral predators in the Indo-Pacific, and they have increased their population in the last 50 years, causing additional coral mortality. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. First of all, nutrient-rich runoff has allowed a lot of algae blooms in these areas, and that has increased the survival of sea star larvae. Also, due to overfishing, we've actually reduced the predators on sea star larvae. So essentially, we have more sea star larvae actually coming to full adulthood after, their processes. Another option, for erosion or bioerosion is boring clams, sponges, and other invertebrates. Essentially, things that go and start to weaken the coral stand from underneath, leaving it vulnerable to wave action. You can see that one picture on the right where you kind of have a thin column and the coral's sort of bigger on the top, that sort of flipped mushroom thing. Eventually, that's going to topple, right? Another cause of erosion can be the change in pH from what we call ocean acidification. Now, healthy corals require slightly alkaline seawater, about 8.1 to 8.5 in the pH scale. Now, ocean acidification is a process in which the pH of the ocean is reduced over an extended period of time, usually attributed to the rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So the average ocean pH has actually dropped from about 8.2 to about 8.1 over the last 150 to 200 years. This is due to essentially an increase in CO2 dissolution from the ocean into the ocean from the atmosphere. So as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels increase, more CO2 is being diffused into the ocean. This results in higher levels of carbonic acid, H2CO3, which essentially lowers the pH. And you can sort of see this in the graph to the right. You'll see the red line is essentially the increase in CO2 within the atmosphere off of Mauna Loa, which is a high kind of clean place to take readings. Then if you look at the seawater concentration, which is in green, and then the pH in the seawater, which is in blue, you'll notice again how the CO2, the green, is going up while the pH is going down. And that's that direct correlation with more CO2, more carbonic acid, it lowers the pH. When we lower pH, this stresses corals. Now, there's a few reasons for this. It prevents corals from absorbing calcium carbonate, which is needed to build skeletal structure. It also halts reef growth and leads to skeletal loss over the long term. And you can see this on the graph to the right, which is the growth rate of tropical corals in relation to change in pH. As the pH skews a little lower, more to the acidic, the percentage of coral growth rate starts to go down on the scatter plot. Now, of course, this brings up the concept of climate change, right? Which is the next cause of erosion, climate change and change in temperature. Now, climate change is a change in global or regional climate patterns since the late 20th century, and this generally results in lower pH levels, which we've already talked about, and rising temperatures. And you can see the kind of correlation between temperatures and carbon dioxide in the graphs on this page. And there's actually two kind of time scales here. One is between 1880 and 2020, and you can see that on the right. There's obviously an increase going on pretty steadily across the board. But if you look at the more long-term changes in carbon dioxide in terms of parts per million, going back 800,000 years or so, and look where we are now, we are way above where we have been in 800,000 years. So this just gives you a little bit of perspective on what the changes are happening here in our atmosphere, in our oceans, and on our planet. This brings us to the concept of coral bleaching, which is the whitening of coral that results from the loss of coral's symbiotic zooxanthellae. Now, of course, we are dealing with reef-building corals here. That's what we're talking about. This occurs when corals become stressed, which can occur due to decreased pH. It can also due to increased water temperatures. Now, coral polyps reject symbiotic zooxanthellae. That's what happens when they get stressed. And then the corals turn white. The reason for this is because corals really don't have a lot of coloration to begin with. So when the zooxanthellae, which really create their color, go away, all you have is clear tissue that reveals the calcium carbonate below, and that's why you get that white coloration. Now, this essentially stops reef growth because there's no skeletal growth going on. They're not able to calcify very well at all. Now, longer bleaching periods can cause coral death due to lack of nutrients and poor water conditions. And here on the bottom, you can see this transition in terms of a coral bleaching event. This happened in a healthy coral December 2014. By February of 2015, it was bleached. And by August of 2015, you can see that color that you see, that's not the coral. It's not alive. It's algae and stuff growing on top of the coral skeletons that are left behind after the algae dies. Now, we can't forget physical damage. Now, I actually mentioned this when we talked about the reef crust before, but when you start getting corals that are growing too close to the surface, where they start to get exposed to air, especially during low tides in the spring, tide scenario, that kind of a thing, that can cause desiccation and removal of moisture and thus dying out of the organism. So that sort of limits the upward growth as we go. Now, we have had some seismic activity scenarios where literally an uplift happened and it sort of dry docked the corals and then they died off. But a lot of times this is just a limiting factor to where the ocean surface is. Now, hurricanes, typhoons, and tropical storms can also do a lot of damage. They can cause extensive physical damage. High energy waves break up coral. Now, oddly enough, they tend to break up a lot of the more branching and quicker growing variety of corals, and those pieces and fragments can actually colonize in other areas as they get distributed after they get broken off. So there's a back and forth in this, not necessarily all bad. It's just the nature's way of sort of trimming and pruning, if you will. Now, rubble can also smother, and sediments can smother corals, and algae can then regrow after storms as well. So there's a balance of things that can happen. And speaking of that, presence of sediments in general can cause problems as well. Excess small sediments and silt can cause water to be very turbid, which means light can't get down there. And sediments can actually settle directly on the coral and the polyps and smother them. So those are things that can happen as well. We can't forget human-caused threats, of course, and under human-caused threats, we have more physical damage. For example, silly tourists and divers who don't know how to control their buoyancy, as that top right picture shows you, are stepping all over things, and that can cause problems. Boat collisions can cause problems. Destructive fishing practices can cause problems, especially if they're removing a lot of the grazing species that help keep excess algae down. We also have issues with the removing of tropical fish species, and this can be very destructive. Now, we have tight regulations of it for that in the US for the most part. However, we don't in the rest of the world, and there are a lot of problems with collection of tropical fish for the tropical fish industry. In fact, I think it's one of the worst things that we do out there in terms of coral reefs, and there's some areas where they still use cyanide and dynamite fishing to be able to get the tropical fish out, which is not really good as well. So those are all destructive fishing practices that can cause problems on a coral reef. Another thing that happens due to humans is harvesting of corals, and this can be very destructive, obviously, and they harvest it for a couple of reasons. They can use it for construction. It can also be used for jewelry and souvenirs. These are all very problematic. I know if I ever show you all pieces of coral, those have been handed down for me through environmental institutes. There have been dried up pieces I found on beaches. I do not purchase coral from souvenir shops for that very reason, and I use my coral pieces for education only, not for display and just kind of vanity things. So there's things to look at in that aspect as well. And of course, coastal development can be very problematic as well. Because it produces nutrient runoff, pesticides get in the water, toxic waste, and increased sedimentation. All of those things can decrease the growth of corals. Under human-caused threats, we also list things like climate change, ocean acidification, and increased temperatures. Now, we've already talked about those components and the nuts and bolts of them, but why are they under human-caused? It's not that some of this stuff doesn't happen naturally. It's just that right now in our time frame, we are the driving force. Humans are the driving force pushing some of these to happen. The production of greenhouse gases, essentially increasing atmospheric CO2. We know that's human driven right now in this geologic moment. Doesn't mean that it hasn't happened in the past geologically, but right now we are the causal of that. Now, the other one is coral diseases, and this is an interesting one, and I'll get into it in a minute, but essentially there's over 20 diseases that have been identified, including black band, white pox, and white plague. Now, diseases are not strictly human-made. I mean, every species on the planet has diseases. It's part of the balance of life. However, the diseases that we see here in the corals, like for example here in Florida, have been given sort of a carte blanche lease to kind of run rampant because the corals are more susceptible due to environmental stresses. So when you stress the corals because of ocean acidification, because of increased temperatures and bleaching events, because of low water quality and toxins in the water, things like that, it stresses the coral and making them more susceptible to the diseases that are there. So what happens when you look at the bigger picture and how these constructive and destructive forces balance out? Well, if you want a reef that's growing and getting larger all the time, you want more constructive forces than destructive forces. Now, unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing here in Florida. Now, in Florida, we've had some tracking on this now, and when we look at this graph, this is put out locally. And if you look at this around what we call the Heliocene thermal maximum, which is between 8,000 5,000 years ago or so, we had sort of the highest rate of accretion on coral reefs, essentially calcium carbonate being laid down. And then it started to go down due to the climatic cooling that occurred after that. And Florida's reefs are essentially stated as being geologically succinct. What essentially that means is that we are no longer really developing. Our coral reefs sort of stayed at a status quo for a while, but now in modern times with anthropogenic sort of warming and stresses that are going into the reef, we are now in a negative balance where our accretion is negligible and we have way more destruction and forces going on than accretion, and thus our reef track is essentially declining in general in Florida. Now, there are various reasons why that's happening that we've talked about, but also you have to look at where Florida is. Florida is sort of at the upper limit of where you get coral reefs due to climate as it is. So it doesn't take much change in our situation to sort of knock our corals down some. Now, if you go to other parts of the world, you still have more of a growth balance than a decline balance. So there are differences here and there, but all of the reefs around the world really are being threatened by quite a lot of destructive forces. So now let's focus in on the importance of coral reefs. Now, this is sort of linked into a lot of things we've talked about already this year. Now, first, maintenance of biodiversity. Now, coral reefs occupy 1% of the seafloor, but they provide home for 25% of all marine life. So that's a big ratio for how small of an area they really produce, or they actually hold. They also provide a lot of other essential services. For example, food from the reef. More than 6 million fishermen in nearly 100 countries harvest fish, mollusks, and crustaceans from coral reefs. The coral reef fishing industry begins in about $6.8 billion globally each year, which is huge. Coastal protection is another important thing. Reefs in general absorb 97% of the energy of waves coming into the shoreline. So when you have a barrier reef system, for example, that's really going to be a protection for your shoreline. Wave height is also reduced by an average of 84%. This all protects shorelines from erosion. The benefits to coastal systems like mangroves and estuaries are really important, especially as they serve as nurseries. We also use coral reefs as a source of medicines, and corals and other animals produce chemicals that prevent predation. And due to that, they actually have interesting uses. Some of these chemicals can hold cures for things like cancer, arthritis, and even Alzheimer's. And of course, there's recreation and tourism, right? They provide recreation, boating, diving, snorkeling. That generates more than $35 billion through tourism each year. It promotes jobs in hospitality, in the food industry, construction, infrastructure, boating, diving, all of these sorts of things. This has even led to a promotion of doing artificial reef programs around the world. And an artificial reef is an underwater structure built by humans to mimic the characteristics of a natural reef. They're constructed out of a variety of materials, usually cement modules, sunken ships, and so on. They generally need to be non-toxic, so there's usually some work that has to be done when you're sinking a ship, for example. But they're placed in locations that don't generally have suitable substrate, so you don't have things for corals larvae to settle on. And once they provide that, all of a sudden larvae starts to settle, and voila, you have a reef system that starts to form with corals, sponges, algae, and whatnot. The picture to the far left there is actually of the reef modules that were put down at Phil Foster Park over there at Blue Heron Bridge that we often do some snorkel trips at. So you can actually go and snorkel that reef. It looks a lot different now because it's very much overgrown by marine life. When it comes to artificial reefs, there's a very big benefit to the community. Obviously, it increases tourism, which can be positive. It also can be negative because you increase more people and being involved. They can protect the shoreline by dissipating wave energy, so that's actually very useful as well. There are potentials for extending the range of some invasive species like the orange cup coral or a lionfish as well, but for far, they're usually a pretty good use of our funding. But you can imagine, why is funding available? Because it has a bankable effect, and we know that. And if we know that, then we need to be putting that money also into protecting coral reefs themselves, because we know they have a value. And that is it for today. Remember those main ideas, that there is a balance between the constructive and destructive forces of the reef, and that changes in biotic and abiotic factors in the ocean can lead to erosion of a coral reef. Artificial structures can be provided as substrates on which reef communities can develop. And of course, until next time, keep learning.